Hi everyone, my name is Maddie, welcome back to my channel and welcome to this video where I'm going to be talking through a lot of whimsical fantasy recommendations. So for anyone who doesn't know, the amazing Cassidy over at Covers with Cassidy is hosting a readathon in April, which is called Realmathon. I am one of the hosts of this readathon. I am the ruler of one of the realms. The realm I am a ruler of is Serane, which is like the water realm, and the subgenre for our realm, because it's a whole readathon based on military fantasy and fantasy, but the subgenre for Serane is whimsical fantasy, which for anyone that knows me, knows my reading tastes, they'll see why that fits. But I also completely agree that whimsical fantasy is a really hard thing to define, and there have been loads of people asking, does this count as whimsical fantasy? I don't know what counts as whimsical fantasy, I don't know what to read. So I have got 3 huge stacks of books, which are all books that I consider whimsical fantasy. About 2/3 of them are books I've read and would recommend. There are a few, maybe like 8 to 10, which I haven't read, which are ones I might pick up during the month, but I thought I'd mention anyway. So there's a lot of books here. I'm going to be trying to run through them pretty quickly, and a lot of them are very not surprising given you're on my channel, but we're going to do it anyway. I would also say the definition of whimsical fantasy is sincerely vague. I have included some things that some people wouldn't. I am sure there are things which other people would include that I don't. We're not stressing about it. It's a fun time. I think the general rule Cassidy's gone with, which is something I subscribe to as well, is if you think it counts, count it. If you don't count it. Don't be that person. So it's a very simple line there. Just read it, see if it feels like that whimsy vibe, especially the ones I've not read. I know a bit of a blurb, maybe, and so I don't actually know if they're going to be whimsical, it's just what vibe they've given me. So we're going to launch straight into it with the obvious ones, and then we'll go into the slightly more obscure. So we're actually going to start off by like grouping some books by author, because there's multiple authors where I have multiple books for each. The first is Erin Morgenstern. So 2 books here, The Night Circus and The Starless Sea. Both of these to me are whimsical fantasy. I'm classing whimsical fantasy as anything with any kind of fantasy feel that's not like high, epic, crazy fantasy. So things with a bit of magic and a bit of weirdness that feel generally kind of magical. So both of these fit this to a T. The Night Circus is a historical kind of romantic whimsical fantasy following Celia and Marco, who are the children of magicians and are themselves being trained in magic. And very basically, there is some form of magical competition going on. And there is a circus which appears at dusk, disappears at dawn, and it arrived without warning. It's a great time, I love it, it's my favourite book of all time. We then have The Starless Sea, which follows Zachary, and in this he finds a book and reads it and finds some very odd stuff in this book, and so decides to start investigating it and gets thrown into a labyrinthine world all to do with books and reading and storytelling. It's great. It's a great time. These both 100% fit whimsical fantasy. Another all-time favourite author for me is Laini Taylor, whose books also very much fit whimsical fantasy. The first series I will tell you about is the trilogy, the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, plus there is actually a novella as well. This is kind of an urban fantasy, but it has so many elements of whimsy to me. Personally, I think it absolutely fits. In this, you're following Karu, who is an art student in Prague, and she has a slightly odd upbringing and has a family. They're not what you would expect. They're chimera, they're not human. One of them is almost like, feels like a demon kind of thing. And things start happening. She loses connection to this family and has to start seeking them out again. And there's angels, there's demons, there's a big love story. It kind of feels, especially the first one, like a bit of a Romeo and Juliet retelling. It's a great time. And then the other series is The Strange the Dreamer duology with Strange the Dreamer and Muse of Nightmares. This I do think is slightly more questionable as whimsical fantasy. It does have some kind of epic fantasy plot aspects in the sense of them going on this big journey to a like lost world. But I personally think it feels exceedingly whimsical. In this, you are following Laszlo, and he is obsessed with this lost city called Weep, and he has studied it for years. He is working as a librarian, and it is just his passion, learning about this lost city, and an opportunity arises by one way or another for him to go and visit this lost city and try and help them out. It's fantastic. I think it's absolutely whimsical. It's gods and magic and strangeness, so it works for me. Next up, we have Alex E. Harrow, and I have 3 books here. The first being The 10,000 Doors of January. 100%, I just got an email, 100% whimsical fantasy. This is a portal fantasy kind of story within a story, all of that going on. Following January, who is, you know, separate from her parents and has been living in the care of someone else, and then she finds this mysterious book and starts reading it, and it leads her through a series of different things. The reason I'm being so vague is because I can't actually remember what happens in this book, because I read it almost 3 years ago, but it's bloody fantastic, is what it is. It's absolutely fantastic, and definitely whimsical fantasy. Next up, maybe slightly less whimsical, but I count anything with witches and magic as whimsical fantasy, The Once and Future Witches. This is a gorgeous, empowering story of like the power of women, and it's all about these 3 sisters who are, you know, descended from witches, but all the witches were eradicated and magic has basically been lost. And these 3 sisters reconnect with each other, and through a series of events, basically have to rediscover the power that their ancestors have. And it's set against the suffrage movement in America, so it's all very like women's rights, give us power. It's amazing, I love it. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I've never felt more empowered than having read this book. It's fantastic. And then if you're looking for a slightly shorter book, A Spindle Splintered by Alex E. Harrow. This is the first book in the Twisted Tales. It's not Twisted Tales. This is the first book in a series of novellas that Alex Harrow is releasing, which kind of retell different fairy tales-ish, but you are following, I cannot remember the main character's name, Zinnia, and she has been ill her entire life and somehow gets sent into basically an alternate universe, and like it helps her illness. This is all, I can't even remember, it's like 150 pages, it's a great time. Again, really feminist, queer, it's a good old time. And really short, which is always good for a readathon. Especially for the weekend 48-hour readathon in the middle of the month. The next author is actually Maggie Stiefvater. I only have one of the books here, which is The Raven Boys from the Raven Cycle, which is the first series I'm going to talk about, but I do think quite a few of her other series do actually fall into this as well. So The Raven Boys is absolutely whimsical fantasy. This is, you know, magic and ley lines and like slightly odd things and a bit of like occult and spirits and witches, all that side of things. So it's definitely whimsical fantasy. And in this you follow Blue, who meets this group of boys, and the group of boys are searching for this lost king, and Blue has in many ways a curse on her that if she kisses the first person she falls in love with, she will kill them. So there's that whole side of things going on, and she's descended from like a family of witches. There's a lot going on, it's a good time, it's a fun YA, kind of classic YA series, but I really enjoy it, highly recommend. Another Maggie Stiefvater series, if you really want to go back to like the 2012 YA, is the Tale of Fairy, I think it might be called, but Lament and Ballad and Lament, I don't know which around the books go, but it is a duology, and you know, it's fae, it's fairy, which to me feels very whimsical fantasy, and it's, you know, music and weird sprites in the forest and things going on and bargains and curses and all of that. I don't know much more than that because I've not read it since 2012, so I don't remember what happens in it. And then the final one from Maggie Stiefvater, I would say, is the Crooked Saints, All the Crooked Saints. God, it's been a while since I've read these books. And this is a much more, I say more modern setting. I think it may be set in like the 50s-ish. And it follows a magical family who have curses they're trying to break. Again, it fits the bill. I don't know much more than that, but you get the vibe. Next up, which we have a lot of options for, V. Schwab. Now, I am not going to try and say that all of V. Schwab's books count as whimsical fantasy, but I do think a good chunk of them do, so worth running through them. The first, and probably the closest, is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I didn't personally love this book, but a lot of people do. This is a story of a girl called Addie who strikes a deal with the devil, where she basically gets to escape the life that she's currently leading and gets to live forever. However, the other side of this deal is that no one can ever remember her, so she must live through life completely isolated, and it's showing how she does to cope with this, what she makes of her life because of it, until all of a sudden one day she meets a guy and he remembers her, and things go from there. It was an alright book, not my favourite, but it's a popular one and it's definitely whimsical fantasy. The next is a duology, which is the Archived duology, so the Archived and the Unbound. This is all about a girl who basically has a job that she has to help spirits kind of meet their final resting point, I think. So I think basically you have these like restless spirits who kind of wake up and cause chaos, and she has to go like sort them out, and she meets a guy who's doing the same. Again, I've not read these in a bloody long time, but I remember really enjoying them. It was a really good, like quite quick duology, and I think this duology has actually been published in like one bind up in the UK as The Dark Vault, so highly recommend some like fun, rompy, but slightly more intense YA. And then I also recommend V. Schwab's latest release, which is Gallant. This is absolutely whimsical but kind of gothic fantasy. It is YA, and this follows Olivia, who has grown up basically as an orphan, and the only thing she has from, you know, her life before was a journal from her mum, and it shows all sorts of things, but the one message in it that is key is do not go to Gallant. You'll be safe as long as you don't go to Gallant, I still don't know. And one day she gets an invitation to go meet her lost family at Gallant, so she goes. And things happen. It's very interesting, it's gothic, it's moody, it's atmospheric, it's beautifully written. Highly recommend. Absolutely whimsical fantasy. Just had the thought. I think the reason I struggle with defining whimsical fantasy is when people think of whimsy, they think of like cute and like fairy tale and like kids stories, and like that's not what I think of. When I think whimsical fantasy, I'm thinking light fantasy, I think more, which is probably why I define it slightly different than a lot of people. The final author I'll mention very briefly is TJ Klune, who has two relatively recent releases, both of which definitely fit whimsical fantasy. The House in the Cerulean Sea and Under the Whispering Door. House in the Cerulean Sea is a relatively wholesome story following Linus, who is miserable in his life and his job, which doesn't fit with the wholesome, and ends up basically going to this island where there is a house for children. He has to look at some stuff there, and, you know, cute things happen. It's a good time. And then we have Under the Whispering Door, which is wholesome in a very different kind of way. And this follows Wallace. Linus and Wallace, the names get me for these books. But this follows Wallace, who dies right at the beginning of the book, and basically has to come to terms with his own death, and grieve himself and the life he maybe didn't have. And he does that in this magical tea shop. It's a good time. They're weird, they're whimsical. So I now have two standalones which I have read, and then we're going to go on to a whole load of novellas because it's a readathon and sometimes you need the quick book. So first up of the chunkier books that I've read, A Marvellous Light by, I was going to say Alex E. Harrow. No, Freya Marske. A Marvellous Light by Freya Marske. This is a fantastic book. I love it a lot. It is Edwardian England, so kind of the 1900s, somewhere there, not sure which century. And it is following two main characters. This is very queer, very queer. And there's bits of magic going on. And one of these characters knows about magic and is magical, one of them not so much. And a big kind of mystery happens, and they have to go figure it out, and there's a lot of pining and longing. So if that's what you want, and like quite a slow burn romance, you're in the right place. Also lyrical, beautiful writing, and just like all the feelings, and surprising amount of smut. And then the other standalone I have, a bit different, is In Deeper Waters by F.T. Lukens. This again is very queer, and this is a historical kind of magical fantasy following, I can never remember the names, Tal, who is on his coming of age tour. So he goes out into the world, sails around a bit to come of age at like age 16-ish. This is a YA. And in this time he comes across lots of magical things, and there is magic going on in the world, and it's all pretty interesting. It's a relatively short standalone. It's good fun. It's a fun, quick read. I think I read this in a day, so I'd recommend. Now we move on to the novellas, and I have a lot of these. So first up, we have The Queen of Eoflaria by Effie Calvin. Maybe slightly questionable for whimsical, I don't know. It gives me the vibe, even though it is just like a fantasy. But this is a gorgeous sapphic fantasy where it's set in a world where like who you fall in love with gender-wise just doesn't really matter at all. So you're following this princess who is being sent to another kingdom to marry their king, and you know, that's the deal. However, whilst she is traveling, the king dies. So by the time she gets there, like, cool, you're marrying the next in line, the queen. So it becomes a sapphic romance, and there's dragons, and it's a good old time. This is also the start of a series. I have not continued the series personally, but there are more little novellas if you want them. It's slightly longer than most, at like 170 pages, but it's so good. Next up, we have a huge series of novellas with The Wayward Children. I cannot be bothered to hold all 7 of them, but there are 7 of these books currently out. These are again a portal fantasy, and they follow sort of the aftermath of kids who go through magical doors. So think Alice in Wonderland, think Narnia. It follows what happens to those kids when they get back, and in this they go to Eleanor West's home for wayward children, and they kind of get help either finding their door again or accepting the fact that they won't. Each book follows slightly different characters, like has a different main character, and they alternate between the 1st, 3rd, 5th and 7th book are set in our world and seeing these kids deal with things, and the 2nd, 4th and 6th books are set in kids' worlds, and you're seeing them like when they find their door and their story through that. And all the characters are like interspersed throughout, so you have a main core cast, you just have slightly different focus each book. It's a great time. I love them. All 7 of them are fantastic. I think the lowest I've given any of them is a high 4-star. Recommend them highly. And, you know, novellas. Next up are 2 novellas by S.T. Gibson. First up we have A Dowry of Blood, which is very reflective. This is a gothic queer retelling of Dracula's Brides. I've not read the original, but this was a good time. Basically, you are following, what is her name? Constanta? Her, who basically is telling the story of why she has killed Dracula, who is her husband. And it's queer, it's polyamory, there's a lot of things going on. It spans a huge time frame. It's fascinating. The writing is stunning. Super quick read as well. I would highly, highly recommend it. Next up we have Odd Spirits by S.T. Gibson. This is a teeny tiny little book. It's about 70 pages long, but this follows a couple who are both magical witches, all of this, and they're not necessarily the happiest, and there's loads of weird things going on in their house, and they're trying to figure out what and how to fix it. I wouldn't say more than that because it's tiny, but it's a really, really fun little read. Warning for biphobia in this, but as I've said in previous videos, it's relevant to the plot and handled very well, but warning if you don't want to read that. Next up is The Green Hollow Duology by Emily Tesh with Silver in the Wood and Drowned Country. I have not read Drowned Country yet, though I very much want to, but Silver in the Wood is a fantastic book. These are, again, slightly kind of southern gothic vibes and follows like the green man in the woods kind of thing, who is responsible for taking care of this big green space, and there's lots of weird goings on. It's a very hard one to describe, but it's a good time. And then another one I will completely fail at describing is The Singing Hills Chronicles. Maybe? This series. The Empress of Salt and Fortune and When the Tide Came Down the Mountain by Givo. I, again, have only read the first of these books, but I've heard fantastic things about the second, and I think there's a third one coming out this year as well. This follows the story of Rabbit? I don't know. Yeah, handmaiden. And I think she's almost like telling the story of what happened in her life, because she was like handmaiden to the royals, I think. It says at the back, a feminist high fantasy, an indictment of monarchy, an evocative debut following the rise of an empress who has few resources and fewer friends. It's a good time, they're super short, really good one to like fly through, again, especially in the 48-hour readathon. Right, we are now moving on to all the books I haven't read, so I was gonna say the blurbs are gonna be even worse. I don't think they can get much worse than what they've been so far, but bear with me. And these are just all either standalones or first books in series, which are intriguing and to me kind of fit within the whimsical fantasy category. First up, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I know precisely nothing about this. It follows Pan, and it's apparently good and weird. That's all I know. I very intentionally do not know more than that and do not want to know more than that. But this is one I will be reading for the readathon, I do think. I am intending to read this in the first week of April as probably my first book for the readathon. So, Piranesi. It's definitely whimsical fantasy even though I know nothing about it. Next up, I don't know much about this one either. An Enchantment of Ravens. I don't know if this is whimsical, but again, it's fae, and fae give me whimsy vibes personally, so I'm gonna claim it. This follows a girl who I believe is hired because the fae can't like create, so she is hired to paint a portrait of someone important, and I think she paints emotion into their eyes, and then that's like not okay, and she gets taken away and it turns into a romance. I've heard there's really good banter, it sounds like a good time. This is another one I may try and read, but we're claiming it. Next up is one I will guaranteed get people disagreeing with me on, but I don't care. The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This is a dark academia, but it's again like mild magic, slightly odd setting, which to me feels whimsical fantasy, so we're going with it. I have read half of this one. I didn't love it, so I stopped reading it, but I might give it another go at some point, I'm undecided. But this follows a group of 6 people who are recruited to be the latest intake basically to the Library of Alexandria, where they will compete for 5 positions to become like new parts of this society, I guess. And yeah, one of them won't get through, and so it's a lot of, you know, allies versus enemies, trying to like get allegiances in this group to make sure you make it through the year. And yeah, I don't know much more than that because I've not read more than that. I've heard rumours that it's queer. I've also heard people saying it's not queer, so like take that as you will. I have no idea. Next up is The Nature of Witches. I know nothing about this other than the witches have seasonal magic, and witches with seasonal magic to me sounds whimsical as hell. Plus the cover just looks it. I don't know why, it just does. But it says, for centuries, witches maintained the climate, their power peaking in the season of their birth. But their control is faltering as the atmosphere becomes more erratic. All hope lies with Clara, whose rare magic is tied to every season. To me, that sounds like whimsical fantasy. Feel free to disagree or tell me otherwise if you've read it. Next up is Lost in the Neverwoods by Aidan Thomas, which is a Peter Pan retelling. I would also say that Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas does count as whimsical fantasy. I have read and loved that one, but this is the one I have with me, so this is the one we're talking about. I, again, do not know a whole lot about it, but it's, I think, like an after Peter Pan thing, but it's like people getting lost in the woods and weird mysteries and disappearances of kids, and then Peter, who the main character Wendy thought wasn't real and was just a thing in her stories, does appear to be real, and it just sounds very intriguing, and it definitely has that kind of vibe to it. Next up is Alatsoy by Darcy Littlebadger. Again, I've not read it, but I thought this felt like whimsical fantasy, and then I read the first bit of the blurb, and it really does seem it to me. It says, imagine an America very similar to our own. It's got homework, best friends, and pistachio ice cream. There are some differences. This America has been shaped dramatically by the magic, monsters, knowledge and legends of its people, those indigenous and those not. And then, like, so it may not be, it may just be folklore, but that gave me the vibe that there is actually magic in this, and I have heard it classed as fantasy, which implies there probably is something out of the ordinary going on. So I personally get whimsical fantasy vibes from this. Again, if you've read it and I'm wrong, tell me, but I think this would count. We then have 2 more, the final 2 books, which are more on the like speculative fabulism kind of realm. The first being The Fascinators by Andrew Eliopoulos. I don't know much about this, but I know it's in a world where people just have magic. I think it's a normal like urban setting, but you know, people have magic, and people, these like teenagers are trying to learn how to use their magic, and then the last line of it is, there are some problems no amount of magic can fix. So I think it sounds like an absolutely fab time. Is it whimsical fantasy? Probably. It seems like it to me. And then the final book is Each of Us a Desert by Mark Oshiro. This is magical realism, fabulism, speculative. Again, I don't know much about it, but it's definitely got a bit of magic in it. So like in here it says, one night Zoe's wish is granted in the form of Amelia, the cold and beautiful daughter of the town's murderous conqueror. But the two set out on a magical journey across the desert. They find their hearts could be a match. Like, magical desert. That's whimsical. We're going with it. Each of Us a Desert by Mark Oshiro. So I don't even slightly know how many books I've recommended in this video, probably in the order of 30, probably all of them with rubbish synopses, and all of them are just vibes. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a feel for what kind of books would work for this, for the readathon, and maybe even some or a lot of ideas of books you could be reading. As I said, I may well be reading a few from this selection. I also may not. I think this has been mentioned before, the readathon, you do not have to read your team's subgenre, and you absolutely do not even have to read fantasy. I have a lot of contemporary lined up for April that I want to read. I don't intend to change that, honestly. You know, I don't wanna. We're gonna go with it. And that's fine. I'll fit prompts where I can, I'll have a good time, I'll get points on my team when and how I can, and it'll be a fun time. But yes, that is my video for all the Whimsical Fantasy recs. Hopefully it was useful. Hopefully you're all joining in on Realmathon. I'll link all the information, including Cassidy's announcement video below, of course. And I'll see you all in April for that. But that is it for this video, so bye, and I'll see you in the next one.